quantity at any given moment, when compared with the quantity of commodities, is compensated for by the velocity of its circulation. The higher levels of finance illustrate clearly that the substance of money plays only a very minor role in value transactions. In 1890, the Bank of France had a turnover on current accounts which was 135 times the amount of the money actually deposited, 54 billion as against 400 million francs, while at the German Reichsbank the ratio was 190. Within the total sum of money in use, which determines the money price of commodities, the actual amount of money is negligible in relation to the total available as a result of its circulation. Thus it is possible to assert, with reference to a specific period but not to a single moment, that the total quantity of money in circulation corresponds with the total amount of objects saleable during this period. The individual also makes his expenditures and accepts the prices for larger purchases not in relation to his momentary disposal of money, but in relation to his total income over a prolonged period. In our equation, the money fraction may attain equality with the commodity fraction through the fact that its denominator is not the quantity of money available as a substance, but as a multiple of this amount determined by the circulation of money during a given period. From this point of view, the antinomy between the stock of available commodities and those commodities that are the value counterparts of money can be solved, and the assertion that no basic disproportion can arise between the total amount of commodities and of money in an autonomous economic area may be upheld. This is true in spite of disagreements about the proper relation between a particular commodity and its price, in spite of the fluctuations and discrepancies that may develop if some definite size of the fractions concerned has become psychologically established while a different one has become more appropriate by reason of objective changes, and in spite of temporary shortages in the means of exchange resulting from a rapid increase in the number of transactions, imports and exports of metal, which are the result of a shortage or excess of money in relation to commodity values in a given country, are nothing but adjustments within a larger economic area in which particular countries are the provinces. They indicate that a proper relation between two provinces has been restored after changes have occurred in one of them. Under these circumstances, an answer to the question whether a given price is appropriate or not can be derived directly from the two previous questions. First, what is the amount of money and the sum total of objects for sale at the present time, and, second, what proportion does the object under consideration form of the total quantity of commodities available? The second question is the decisive one. The equation between the commodity fraction and the money fraction can be objectively and quantitatively true or false, whereas the equation between objects in general and money in general is only a matter of expediency, not one of truth in the sense that it can be logically established. The relationship between the totalities has, as it were, the significance of an axiom, which is not true in the same sense as are the statements based upon it. Only the latter can be proven, whereas the axiom cannot refer to anything from which it could be logically derived. A very important methodological rule is established here, which I will illustrate from a completely different category of values. The basic assertion of pessimism is that there is in life a considerable excess of suffering over happiness, that living beings, considered as a whole or on the average, experience much more pain than pleasure. It is quite impossible to make such an assertion, which presupposes that pleasure and pain can be directly balanced and set off against each other as two qualitatively equal magnitudes with opposite signs. In reality, this is impossible because there is no common measure. When we suffer, we cannot experience what amount of pleasure would be necessary to compensate for the suffering. How then can we explain that such comparisons are always being made, that in everyday affairs, in a coherent destiny, in the sum of an individual life, we judge that the quantity of enjoyment has fallen below or has exceeded the amount of pain? It is possible only because the experience of life has taught us, more or less strictly, how fortune and misfortune are actually distributed, how much suffering has to be accepted in order to attain a certain amount of pleasure, and how much of each is man's usual portion. Only when we have formed some notion of this kind, no matter how unconscious and vague, is it possible to say that in a particular case a pleasure has been paid for too dearly, i.e. with too large an amount of suffering, or that in one individual life the pain exceeded the happiness. The average itself cannot be disproportionate because it is the standard by which we determine whether the relation between feelings in an individual case is fair or not. In the same way, it is impossible to say that people on the average are tall or small, since the average provides the standard by which the individual is measured, and it is misleading to say that time passes quickly or slowly, since the passage of time, i.e. the average experienced pace of events, is the measuring rod by which the quickness or slowness of the passage of single events is measured, while the average itself is neither quick nor slow. Thus, the pessimistic assertion that the average human life contains more suffering than enjoyment is methodologically just as impossible as the optimistic assertion of the contrary. The sensation of the total quantities of pleasure and pain, or, differently expressed, the average of them for an individual or for a period of time, is the original phenomenon, whose components cannot be compared with each other because this would require a measure independent of both and yet comprehending both equally. This should suffice to characterize the type of knowledge with which we are dealing here. In the areas mentioned, and also in many others, the primary elements are not comparable because they are of different qualities and cannot be measured by each other or by a third factor. But the fact that a certain amount of one element, and a certain amount of the other element, is present provides a measure to be applied to individual cases, events and problems, where both elements are involved. In so far as, in individual cases, the elements repeat the proportions that occur in the total quantities, then the elements have a correct, i.e. normal, average or typical relation, and deviations appear as a preponderance or disproportion of one element. In themselves, the elements in individual cases have no more a right or wrong, an equal or unequal relation than have the totalities. They acquire such a relation only through the total quantities being established as an absolute, in terms of which the singular, the relative, is calculated. The absolute is not subject to the rules of comparison that it makes possible for the relative.